In the 6 months since the January 6th attack, not only have we seen the promotion of the big lie about election fraud by the right, but we've also seen the growing trend of far-right extremism within the halls of Congress. And among the most closely linked with that extremism is Congressman Paul Gosar, who has emerged over the past year as a friend and ally in the halls of the United States Capitol to those on the fringiest of the far right. Gosar, a 5-term Republican from Arizona, who was one of the most prominent backers of the Stop the Steal movement, if you can call it that, and who has repeatedly voiced baseless conspiracy theories like the false claim that the FBI organized the insurrection, has aligned himself closely with leaders of white nationalist and extremist groups, people like Nick Fuentes, the 22-year-old leader of the America First movement, who the New York Times describes as boasting the kind of resume that most members of Congress would run from, having marched at both the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, as well as outside the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. He has warned that the nation is losing its white demographic core. Other conservative organizations have denounced him as a Holocaust denier and a racist. Mr. Gosar, though, has continued to associate himself with Fuentes. The New York Times adds this about Gosar's connection with Fuentes, quote, the Arizona Republican was the keynote speaker at a conference hosted by Mr. Fuentes' group in February, the only member of Congress to participate. Gosar has spread America First's motto and projects on Twitter and written to the FBI on congressional letterhead in Mr. Fuentes' defense. In return, Fuentes has praised the congressman on his show and on social media channels and urged his followers to donate money to Gosar's campaign. Gosar's unapologetic association with them is perhaps the most vivid example of the Republican Party's growing acceptance of extremism. Gosar has not yet responded to NBC News' request for comment. We're back with Eugene Daniels and Clint Watts. Eugene Daniels, I've asked you this. I've put you on the spot as someone who covers that building and walks around and could bump into Mr. Gosar. But have you ever detected any shame for his close association with white supremacists?
No, I think he tends to play coy, right? When we find out that he's been invited to speak at, a dinner or a fundraiser, or that he did that, which he did earlier this year, where Fuentes was there and he was the headliner of that event that you're talking about. He plays coy, right? What he said is, I have no idea what's going on, when he was asked by reporters in the Capitol. But he also tweeted out, seemingly defending whatever fundraiser that might have been, saying that he wasn't sure why everyone was freaking out. And the reason everyone's freaking out is because of the racism and the white supremacy that is spread at these events and by Fuentes. And I think what's really interesting is you're not hearing on the right, in Republican leadership, kind of any pushback against Gosar, right? We heard that about Marjorie Taylor Greene. You heard that for Lauren Boebert at times, but we've heard almost nothing about Gosar. And that has been something that's kind of been interesting to watch, because Gosar was at that rally. He has continuously spread, like you said, that misinformation about this election. I think he called President Biden a usurper, as if he stole the building that's right behind me. And so it's all of these things that he says, and then when an event happens, he likes to play coy about it. But I think you talk to Democrats, you talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, and they're kind of all saying the thing that they don't understand what's going on with Gosar and why he plays coy or is kind of flirting with these extreme right groups.
And Clint, I guess it doesn't matter anymore if you understand it. I mean, the facts are out before all of us. McCarthy purged Liz Cheney urgently and immediately from his ranks because she refused to repeat a lie. But Gosar sits on committees. Let me read to you from the New York Times reporting about McCarthy and Gosar. The statements and actions have not resulted in any punishment from House Republican leaders who have largely declined to publicly reprimand those in their conference who espouse fringe beliefs or peddle misinformation. Kevin McCarthy of California, the minority leader, told the Washington Post last week that Gosar had told him that the advertised fundraiser was not real. I mean, so Liz Cheney's concern about democracy is real, and she refuses to pretend she's not concerned about disinformation about the election. Gosar's association with Fuentes is real, but McCarthy believes him when he says it isn't, and he's cool and she's not. What role does the establishment of the Republican Party greenlighting these associations play in empowering them?
Nicole, I would love to get an interview with former Congressman King of Iowa, because when this situation played out for him, he was gone. I mean, he was essentially removed from his committees. He was pushed out of office, was no longer really relevant as a politician. In this case, I think Gosar sees it as this is his base to a degree, and he's rolling with it because that is a very vitriolic and outspoken person in Fuentes, who in many ways has replaced some of the folks from that Charlottesville march in 2017. If you remember back to Richard Spencer, was kind of the outspoken person there. Fuentes is equally on par with Spencer in that case. And I think he's prolific in rallying up a younger audience, by the way, for the Republicans, a younger male white audience, I would note. And so it seems as if it plays to an audience and a backers that he wants, and he sees no political risk in it in terms of his location in Arizona. I also, when you showed that clip there of Gosar, it was Marjorie Taylor, was standing right behind him. So it's conspiracies and white supremacy. It's a big stew of sort of nonsense that you see come together over time, which is indicative of what we were just talking about in the last block in terms of January 6th and the denials, the lies, trying to recast history, essentially, about what happened recently, and also try and forge ahead. I think it really shows where the GOP is just politically, that they wouldn't renounce somebody like Gosar today, that they will play to it. And they also are not looking at the dangers that naturally come from embracing a young white extremist that could probably agitate people over time, really be someone who starts to stoke incitement that could really blow back, just the way we saw on January 6th, could blow back on the party once again.
And Eugene, there is a direct line between the ex-president. I remember probing one of his outside advisors. I said, why does he have such a hard time denouncing David Duke? And he said he wants his vote. He wants the votes of the people that support David Duke. And it seems that these Republicans are just an extension of that belief system with potentially deadly consequences.
Yeah, I mean, something that we started realizing about Donald Trump when he was president is that he had a really hard time saying anything negative about people he thought might vote for him, right? He, if you talk to anyone who worked for him, anyone, whether that was in the White House or on The Apprentice, they talk about the transactional way that he thinks about everything, right? And so he says, he thinks, oh, they're going to vote for me, well, I have to be nice to them, right? That is a vote that I want. And so I think that is a different way than most politicians, or most politicians at least used to think, and you're starting to see that a little bit more in the Republican Party now, and that's why you don't see McCarthy talking about Gosar and kind of ridiculing him, because what they're hoping to do is keep the Trump base happy, and to do that you have to keep Donald Trump happy, first of all, but you also kind of have to flirt with these really dangerous parts of society, dangerous parts of white supremacy, these people who think all types of things about people that look like me, right? And so those are the things that are happening, and that's connected to January 6th, and that's connected to whether or not Donald Trump believes that the election was fair and free or not. And so all of those things are happening on the Republican side, and what we're seeing from McCarthy, the bet that he's made, the bet that other leaders have made, is that they're going to need those people's votes in 2022, and he wants to be speaker. So it seems like he's going to kind of keep things cool as much as he can.